The overseer's whip froze mid-arc above the child's back. Not because of mercy. Thomas Whitmore had never shown mercy in 15 years managing Belmont Plantation, but because the boy had just spoken in a language that had been dead since the fall of Rome. The child, no more than 7 years old, stood in the cotton field with blood running from his nose, and the words that came from his mouth were perfect, fluent Latin. Not the church Latin that the priest mumbled over Sunday services. Ancient Latin, the Latin of legions and senators of an empire that had crumbled into dust 18 centuries before this moment. Before we go further into what happened next, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. What you're about to hear is one of the most documented and disturbing cases in the entire historical record of American slavery, and it's a story that's been deliberately buried for over a century and a half. Comment, remember if you believe some truths are too important to forget, and tell me where you're watching from. This story needs to reach every corner of the world, because what happened to this child and what he revealed challenges everything we think we know about memory, identity, and the human soul. Now, let me take you back to how this began. Belmont Plantation sat on 1,200 acres of Louisiana Delta land, 23 miles south of Baton Rouge. The property had been in the Ashford family since 1791, passed down through 3 generations of men who measured their wealth in human beings the way other men counted cattle. By 1863, even as the Civil War raged across the South and Union forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, Belmont remained untouched, an island of brutal routine in a world coming apart at the seams. The plantation held 247 enslaved people in the spring of that year. Their names were recorded in ledgers kept in the main house, each entry listing age, purchase price, and assigned work detail with the cold precision of inventory management. Among those names entered in March of 1856 was a woman called Sarah. No last name, no place of origin beyond Carolina, no family history. Just Sarah, field hand, purchased for $800 at a Charleston auction when she was 16 years old. Sarah had a son in the winter of 1856, a boy the plantation records called simply Sarah's boy until he was old enough to work, at which point he was given the name Marcus. The father was never recorded. On plantations like Belmont, such details were considered irrelevant. What mattered was that Marcus represented future labor, future value, future property to be worked until his body gave out. The boy was strange from the beginning. The other enslaved people noticed it first. He didn't cry as an infant the way other babies cried. He watched people with an intensity that seemed wrong in someone so young, his eyes tracking movements and faces with an awareness that made grown men uncomfortable. By the time he could walk, he would sometimes stop in the middle of the quarters and stare at nothing, his head tilted as if listening to voices no one else could hear. Sarah tried to protect him. She taught him to hide his strangeness, to keep his head down, to never draw attention. In a world where being noticed meant being punished, difference was dangerous. But some things cannot be hidden forever. Marcus learned to speak early, forming complete sentences before his 2nd birthday. But the words he used were often wrong. Not childish mistakes, but words that didn't exist in English. He would point at objects and call them by names that meant nothing to anyone around him. Sarah would correct him gently, desperately, teaching him the proper words, the safe words, the words that wouldn't get him beaten or sold away. The plantation's daily routine was rigid and unforgiving. The enslaved population was divided into 4 gangs. The first gang, composed of the strongest men and women, worked the cotton fields from sunrise to sunset, their hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, their backs bent under the weight of sacks that grew heavier with each passing hour. The second gang handled the sugar cane, a crop that required different skills and produced different injuries, deep cuts from the cane knives, burns from the boiling houses where raw cane was processed into sugar and molasses. The third gang managed the plantation's infrastructure, repairing tools, maintaining buildings, tending the livestock that fed the Ashford family and their guests. The fourth gang consisted of children too young for heavy labor and adults too old or injured to keep pace with the primary work crews. Marcus was assigned to the fourth gang when he turned 5. His jobs included carrying water to the field hands, gathering kindling for the cooking fires, and picking up cotton that had fallen from overfull sacks. Simple tasks, child's work. But even in these basic duties, his strangeness manifested. He would sometimes stop mid-task and draw symbols in the dirt with a stick. Complex geometric patterns that seemed to follow rules no one else understood. When asked what he was doing, he would look confused, as if waking from a dream, and couldn't explain the marks he'd made. The other children learned to avoid him. The adults watched him with a mixture of pity and fear. Thomas Whitmore, the overseer, was a man who had built his reputation on absolute control. He had come to Belmont in 1848, hired by Colonel James Ashford to increase productivity and reduce what the colonel called disciplinary incidents. Whitmore's methods were simple and brutal. He believed that enslaved people were like animals. They responded to pain and fear, and any sign of independent thought or resistance had to be crushed immediately and publicly. Under Whitmore's management, Belmont's cotton production increased by 40%. The cost of this increase was measured in scars, in families torn apart, when troublemakers were sold south to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades, in a constant atmosphere of terror that kept people's heads down and their mouths shut. Whitmore noticed Marcus in the summer of 1862. The boy was 6 years old, carrying a water bucket to the first gang during the midday break. One of the field hands, an older man named Joseph, who had been at Belmont for 30 years, collapsed from heat exhaustion. Marcus set down his bucket and knelt beside Joseph, placing his small hands on the man's chest and speaking in a low, steady voice. The words were not English. They were not the African languages that some of the older enslaved people still spoke in private, the languages that connected them to homelands they would never see again. They were something else entirely, flowing from the child's mouth with a rhythm and structure that sounded ancient, formal, ceremonial. Joseph's eyes opened, his breathing steadied. He sat up slowly, looking at Marcus with an expression of profound confusion and something that might have been recognition. Before anyone could speak, Whitmore's shadow fell across them both. The overseer's first blow caught Marcus across the face, splitting his lip and knocking him into the dirt. The second blow was aimed at his back, but Sarah threw herself between them, taking the lash across her shoulders. Whitmore beat them both methodically and without anger, the way a man might discipline a dog. When he was finished, he ordered Joseph back to work and told Sarah that if her boy ever spoke that devil language again, he would sell them both to the sugar fields, where they would be worked to death within a year. But Marcus couldn't stop. The language came to him in dreams, in waking visions, in moments when his consciousness seemed to slip sideways into memories that couldn't possibly be his own. He saw stone buildings that didn't exist in Louisiana, roads paved with fitted blocks, men in armor that predated anything in the American South by centuries. He heard voices speaking the language that flowed so naturally from his own mouth, and in those moments, he wasn't Marcus, the slave child. He was someone else, someone older, someone who had lived before. Sarah tried everything to protect him. She made him sleep beside her so she could wake him when he started speaking in his sleep. She taught him to bite his tongue when the visions came, to press his fingernails into his palms until the pain drove the memories away. She begged him to be normal, to be safe, to survive. But in April of 1863, everything changed. The Union Army had taken New Orleans the previous year, and their forces were pushing north along the Mississippi River. Belmont Plantation was still deep in Confederate territory, but everyone could feel the world shifting. The enslaved population whispered about freedom in the quarters at night, about Union soldiers who treated black people like human beings, about a proclamation from President Lincoln that had supposedly freed all enslaved people in rebel states, though no one at Belmont had been freed, and Whitmore's whip still fell just as hard. Colonel Ashford was in Baton Rouge that April, meeting with other plantation owners to discuss how to protect their property, human and otherwise, from the advancing Union forces. His wife, Margaret Ashford, remained at the plantation with their 3 children and a household staff of 12 enslaved people who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the illusion of genteel Southern civilization. On April 17, 1863, Margaret Ashford's youngest daughter, Elizabeth, fell ill with a fever that the plantation's doctor, a man named Cornelius Webb, who had learned medicine through apprenticeship rather than formal education, could not identify or treat. The child's temperature climbed steadily over 3 days. She became delirious, crying out in her sleep, her small body racked with convulsions that terrified her mother and the household staff. Dr. Webb tried everything in his limited arsenal: bleeding, purgatives, cold compresses, herbal remedies that had been passed down through generations of folk medicine. Nothing worked. By the evening of April 19th, Elizabeth was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin burning to the touch. In desperation, Margaret Ashford ordered the household staff to bring anyone who might have healing knowledge. The enslaved community had their own medical traditions, knowledge systems that had survived the Middle Passage and been adapted to American plants and conditions. Women who served as midwives, men who could set broken bones, people who knew which roots and leaves could reduce fever or ease pain. Sarah was among those brought to the main house. She had helped with difficult births in the quarters, had nursed people through illnesses that Dr. Webb had given up on. But when she saw Elizabeth Ashford lying in that canopied bed, pale and still, she knew this was beyond her abilities. Marcus was with his mother because Sarah refused to leave him alone in the quarters where Whitmore might find him. The boy stood in the corner of the sick room, watching the dying child with that intense, unsettling focus that had marked him from birth. And then, without warning, he walked to the bedside. Sarah tried to stop him. Margaret Ashford moved to pull him away, but Marcus placed his hands on Elizabeth's forehead and began to speak. The language that came from his mouth was Latin, not the simplified church Latin that educated people might recognize, but the complex, nuanced Latin of the classical period, pronounced with an accent that hadn't been heard since the 2nd century AD. The words flowed in a steady stream, forming what sounded like an incantation or prayer, though the content was medical rather than religious. Marcus described symptoms in precise clinical terms: the fever's pattern, the inflammation in the child's throat, the infection spreading through her lymphatic system. He gave instructions in the same ancient language, his 7-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had done this before, many times, in another life. Dr. Webb stood frozen, his mouth open. He had studied Latin as a young man, enough to read medical texts and understand church services. What he was hearing was impossible. The grammar was perfect. The vocabulary was technical and specific, and it was coming from an illiterate slave child who had never been taught to read or write in any language. Margaret Ashford didn't care about the impossibility. She cared that her daughter was dying. "What is he saying?" she demanded. Dr. Webb translated haltingly. The boy was describing a treatment protocol, specific herbs to be gathered and prepared in a particular way, a mixture that would reduce the fever and fight the infection. The instructions were detailed and precise, including dosages, preparation methods, and timing that Webb recognized from ancient medical texts he had read decades ago but never seen applied in practice. Sarah was sent to gather the herbs Marcus had named. She found them growing wild on the plantation grounds, plants she had walked past 1,000 times without knowing their medicinal properties. She prepared them exactly as Marcus had instructed, her hands shaking as she worked, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The treatment worked. Elizabeth's fever broke within hours. By morning, she was conscious and asking for food. By the end of the week, she had fully recovered. Margaret Ashford was grateful, but she was also terrified. She had been raised to believe that enslaved people were inferior beings, incapable of the kind of knowledge Marcus had displayed. The fact that a slave child had saved her daughter's life using medicine from a dead civilization challenged the entire foundation of her worldview. She told her husband everything when he returned from Baton Rouge. Colonel Ashford's response was immediate and pragmatic. Marcus represented either a valuable asset or a dangerous threat, and the colonel needed to determine which. He brought in experts. First came Father Michael O'Reilly, a Catholic priest from Baton Rouge, who was known for his classical education. Father O'Reilly spent 3 hours with Marcus, speaking to him in Latin and recording the boy's responses. The priest emerged from the interview pale and shaking. The child's Latin was flawless, he reported. More than that, Marcus had discussed theological concepts and historical events from the early Christian period with the familiarity of someone who had lived through them. Next came Professor Edmund Cartwright, who taught classical languages at what would later become Louisiana State University. Cartwright was a skeptic, convinced that the whole thing was either a hoax or a case of the boy having somehow memorized phrases without understanding them. He tested Marcus rigorously, asking him to translate complex passages, to explain grammatical structures, to discuss the differences between various periods of Latin development. Marcus answered every question correctly. More than that, he corrected Professor Cartwright on several points, citing sources and examples that the professor had to verify in his reference books. The boy's knowledge wasn't just accurate, it was comprehensive and nuanced in ways that suggested lived experience rather than academic study. But the most disturbing part came when Cartwright asked Marcus where he had learned Latin. The boy's answer was simple and direct. I spoke it before, when I lived in Rome, when I was a physician named Gaius Marcellus Severus. The name meant nothing to anyone present. But when Professor Cartwright returned to his university and consulted historical records, he found references to a physician by that name who had practiced in Rome during the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century AD. Gaius Marcellus Severus had written several medical treatises that were lost when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but fragments of his work survived in quotations by later physicians. Marcus described details from those lost treatises. He spoke about medical procedures that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 19th century. He recalled specific patients he had treated, political events he had witnessed, streets and buildings in ancient Rome that matched archaeological evidence but weren't documented in any texts an illiterate slave child could have accessed. Colonel Ashford found himself in an impossible position. He owned a slave child who appeared to possess memories from a previous life as a Roman physician. The implications were staggering. If Marcus truly remembered being Gaius Marcellus Severus, it meant that souls could be reborn. It meant that the enslaved people working his fields might carry within them the memories and knowledge of scholars, warriors, kings. It meant that the entire system of slavery, built on the premise that black people were inherently inferior, was a monstrous crime against beings who were not just human but potentially immortal. The colonel couldn't accept that. The economic and social order of his entire world depended on the dehumanization of enslaved people. If Marcus's memories were real, everything the colonel believed and everything he had built his life upon was a lie. So he did what powerful men do when confronted with truths they cannot accept. He tried to make the problem disappear. On May 3rd, 1863, Colonel Ashford sold Marcus and Sarah to a slave trader named William Hutchins, who specialized in moving enslaved people to the Deep South, where questions weren't asked and records were poorly kept. The sale price was listed as $1,200 for both, well below market value. The transaction was recorded in Ashford's ledgers with a single notation: disposed of problem property. But word of the Latin-speaking slave child had already spread beyond Belmont Plantation. Father O'Reilly had written to his bishop about the case. Professor Cartwright had discussed it with colleagues. Dr. Webb had mentioned it to other physicians. The story was too strange, too compelling, too disturbing to remain secret. William Hutchins never made it to his intended destination with his human cargo. On May 7, 1863, his wagon was stopped by a Union cavalry patrol 15 miles south of Baton Rouge. The patrol was led by Captain James Morrison, a Massachusetts officer who had been educated at Harvard and who spoke fluent Latin. When Morrison heard that one of the enslaved people in Hutchins's wagon was a child who supposedly spoke ancient Latin, he ordered the trader to produce the boy. Marcus was brought forward thin and frightened, his wrists raw from the ropes that had bound him during the journey. Captain Morrison addressed him in Latin, asking his name and where he had learned the language. Marcus responded in the same tongue, and the two of them conversed for 20 minutes while the soldiers and the slave trader watched in amazement. Morrison's report to his commanding officer described the encounter in detail. The boy's Latin was superior to that of most Harvard graduates, Morrison wrote. He speaks with the accent and vocabulary of the classical period and demonstrates knowledge of medical practices and historical events that he could not possibly have learned through conventional means. I am convinced that we are witnessing either an unprecedented case of reincarnation or evidence of some form of genetic memory that science has yet to explain. Under the authority of the Emancipation Proclamation, Captain Morrison freed Marcus and Sarah on the spot. William Hutchins protested, claiming financial loss. Morrison informed him that the Iowa Confederacy was a rebel government with no legal authority, that all enslaved people in Confederate territory were legally free, and that if Hutchins continued to object, he would be arrested for kidnapping. Sarah and Marcus were taken to a Union camp where they were given food, clothing, and medical care. Sarah wept for the first time since her son had been born, finally allowing herself to believe that they might survive, that they might be free. But Marcus's story was far from over. Word of the Latin-speaking former slave child reached Washington. President Lincoln, who had a deep interest in unusual phenomena and was known to consult with spiritualists, requested a full report. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, saw potential military intelligence value. If the boy truly possessed memories from a previous life, what other knowledge might he carry? In June of 1863, Marcus and Sarah were brought to Washington under military escort. They were housed in a boarding house on F Street, a few blocks from the White House, and Marcus was interviewed by a succession of scholars, physicians, and government officials. The interviews were exhaustive and often cruel. Marcus was questioned for hours at a time, his answers recorded in meticulous detail, his knowledge tested against historical records and classical texts. Some interviewers were genuinely curious, seeking to understand a phenomenon that challenged their understanding of human consciousness. Others were hostile, determined to prove that the boy was either a fraud or a victim of delusion. Through it all, Marcus remained consistent. He described his life as Gaius Marcellus Severus, with the same clarity and detail that other children might describe their previous day. He spoke of his medical training in Alexandria, his practice in Rome, his patience among the wealthy and powerful. He recalled the smell of the Tiber River, the sound of chariot races in the Circus Maximus, the taste of wine from his family's vineyard in the Alban Hills. He also described his death. Gaius Marcellus Severus had died in 178 AD during the Antonine Plague, the pandemic that killed millions across the Roman Empire. He remembered the fever, the characteristic rash, the gradual shutdown of his body's systems. He remembered his last thoughts as a Roman physician, wondering if anyone would remember his work, if his medical writings would survive to help future generations. And then, Marcus said, there was darkness, not the darkness of sleep or unconsciousness, but an absolute void that he couldn't measure or describe. And then gradually, awareness returned, not as Gaius Marcellus Severus, but as something formless and waiting. And then birth, and a new life, and the slow, terrible realization that he had been reborn into a world where his knowledge and memories were not just useless, but dangerous. The scholars who interviewed Marcus were divided in their conclusions. Some believed he was genuinely experiencing memories from a previous life, that his case provided evidence for reincarnation and the immortality of the soul. Others argued that he must have somehow been exposed to classical texts and absorbed their contents without conscious awareness, though they couldn't explain how an illiterate slave child would have had such access. Still others dismissed the whole thing as an elaborate hoax, though they couldn't identify who would benefit from such a deception or how it could have been orchestrated. Dr. Samuel Morton, a physician and anthropologist who had built his reputation on theories of racial hierarchy based on skull measurements, examined Marcus extensively. Morton was deeply invested in proving that different races represented different species with inherently different capabilities. The existence of a black child with comprehensive knowledge of classical Latin and ancient medicine threatened his entire theoretical framework. Morton's solution was to declare that Marcus was suffering from a form of mental illness that caused him to believe he was experiencing memories from a previous life, when in fact he was constructing elaborate fantasies based on fragments of overheard conversations and random exposure to Latin phrases. The fact that Marcus's knowledge was far too detailed and consistent to be explained by such a mechanism didn't deter Morton from his conclusion. The debate over Marcus's case continued in academic and religious circles for months. Articles were published in medical journals and theological reviews. Some churches embraced his story as evidence of God's mysterious ways and the soul's journey through multiple lives. Others condemned it as heresy and demanded that the boy be silenced. Through all of this, Marcus remained with his mother in Washington, caught between those who wanted to study him and those who wanted to suppress him. Sarah tried to protect her son from the constant scrutiny, but she had no power in this new world of freedom that still treated them as curiosities rather than people. In September of 1863, the situation resolved itself in an unexpected way. Marcus stopped speaking Latin. The memories that had flowed so freely began to fade. He told his mother that Gaius Marcellus Severus was leaving, that the connection between his current life and his previous existence was dissolving like morning fog. By October, Marcus could no longer recall the details of ancient Rome with the same clarity. The medical knowledge remained, but it became abstract rather than experiential. He knew treatments and procedures, but he couldn't remember learning them or applying them as Gaius Marcellus Severus. By November, the Latin itself began to slip away. Words that had come naturally now required effort to recall. Grammar that had been instinctive became confused and uncertain. Dr. Morton declared this proof that the whole thing had been a delusion that was now resolving. But others who had interviewed Marcus extensively believed something different was happening, that the memories of a previous life were incompatible with the development of a new identity, and that as Marcus grew and developed his own personality and experiences, there was simply no room for Gaius Marcellus Severus to remain. By the end of 1863, Marcus was just a boy again, a freed boy with an unusual past and some residual knowledge of medicine that he couldn't quite explain, but no longer the vessel for an ancient Roman physician's memories. Sarah was relieved. She had never wanted her son to be special or remarkable. She had only wanted him to be safe, and now, finally, he could be. The records show that Sarah and Marcus remained in Washington through the end of the Civil War. Sarah found work as a seamstress, and Marcus attended one of the schools established for freed people by the Freedmen's Bureau. He was a good student, particularly strong in mathematics and science, but he showed no unusual abilities or knowledge beyond what any bright child might demonstrate. In 1867, Sarah married a man named Thomas Freeman, a former slave from Virginia who had served in the Union Army and was working as a carpenter in Washington. The family moved to Philadelphia, where there was a larger and more established free black community. Marcus took his stepfather's surname and became Marcus Freeman. He attended medical school at Howard University, which had been founded in 1867 specifically to educate freed people. He graduated in 1875 and established a medical practice in Philadelphia's black community, serving patients who had limited access to white physicians. Dr. Marcus Freeman practiced medicine for 43 years. His patient records, preserved in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, show a physician who was skilled, compassionate, and particularly effective at treating infectious diseases and managing complex medical cases. His colleagues respected him. His patients loved him. He never spoke publicly about his childhood experiences. When asked about his interest in medicine, he would say simply that it had always felt natural to him, that healing was something he understood instinctively. He married in 1878 to a woman named Rebecca Thompson, a teacher at one of Philadelphia's schools for black children. They had 4 children together. Marcus was, by all accounts, a devoted father who insisted that all his children receive the best education possible. In 1893, a journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer tracked down Dr. Freeman and asked him about the stories from his childhood. The Latin-speaking slave child who had supposedly possessed memories from ancient Rome. Marcus was 50 years old by then, a respected physician with a thriving practice and a family he adored. His response was carefully measured. "I was a child who experienced things I couldn't explain. I spoke a language I had never been taught. I remembered places I had never been. Whether those memories came from a previous life, from some genetic inheritance from God, or from my own imagination trying to make sense of a world that treated me as property rather than a person, I cannot say. What I know is that those experiences led me to medicine, and medicine has allowed me to help people. That is enough." The journalist pressed him. Did he still remember being Gaius Marcellus Severus? Did he still speak Latin? Marcus smiled. "I remember remembering," he said, "like a dream that was once vivid but has faded with waking. I can still read Latin. I studied it properly in medical school. But the fluency I had as a child, the sense of having lived in ancient Rome, that's gone. Perhaps it was never real. Or perhaps it was real but incompatible with the life I was meant to live. I choose to focus on the present and the future rather than dwelling on mysteries I cannot solve." Dr. Marcus Freeman died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic that killed millions worldwide. He was 75 years old. His obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune described him as a pillar of the community, a skilled physician, and a man who dedicated his life to healing and service. There was no mention of Latin or ancient Rome or reincarnation, but the records from 1863 remain. Father O'Reilly's letters to his bishop, describing conversations with a 7-year-old slave child who discussed early Christian theology in flawless classical Latin. Professor Cartwright's detailed notes on Marcus's knowledge of Roman history and medicine. Captain Morrison's military report on freeing a boy who spoke like a Harvard graduate despite never having been taught to read. Dr. Morton's case files, arguing that the whole thing was a delusion, even as he documented knowledge that no delusion could explain. The case of Marcus Freeman, the slave child who spoke a language dead for 2,000 years and claimed to have lived before, remains one of the most thoroughly documented and least explained phenomena in the historical record of American slavery. It raises questions that we still cannot answer. Is reincarnation real? Can souls carry memories across lifetimes? Or was Marcus's experience something else entirely, a form of genetic memory, a psychological phenomenon we don't yet understand, a spiritual gift or curse that defied natural law? But perhaps the most important question is this: how many other enslaved people carried within them knowledge, memories, and capabilities that were never recognized or valued because the system that held them in bondage refused to see them as fully human? Marcus was noticed because his knowledge was so specific and verifiable that it couldn't be ignored. But what about the others? The field hands who might have been scholars in previous lives, the house servants who might have been warriors or artists or kings, the children sold away from their families who might have carried within them the accumulated wisdom of multiple lifetimes. The system of slavery was built on the deliberate erasure of identity, history, and humanity. Enslaved people were stripped of their names, their languages, their cultural heritage, their family connections. They were reduced to property, to labor units, to bodies without souls or minds worth acknowledging. What if that erasure extended beyond a single lifetime? What if the crime of slavery wasn't just the theft of freedom and dignity in the present, but the denial of all that a soul had been and might become across the vast span of existence? Marcus Freeman's story suggests that the human spirit is far more complex and enduring than the systems that try to contain it. That knowledge and identity can survive even the most brutal attempts at erasure. That a child born into slavery might carry within him the memories of a Roman physician, and that those memories might save lives and challenge the very foundations of the society that sought to dehumanize him. The records from 1863 sit in archives in Louisiana, Washington, and Pennsylvania. They are available to anyone who wants to examine them. The letters, the interview transcripts, the medical reports, the military documents, all of it preserved, all of it documented, all of it unexplained. History is full of mysteries that challenge our understanding of what is possible. But this one is different because it's not just about the supernatural or the unexplained. It's about a child who was enslaved, who was bought and sold like livestock, who was beaten for speaking a language that proved he possessed knowledge his owners could never acknowledge. It's about a mother who tried desperately to protect her son from a world that would destroy him for being different. It's about a system so invested in dehumanization that it couldn't accept evidence of humanity even when that evidence spoke in the language of Cicero and healed the dying with the medicine of Marcus Aurelius's Rome. And it's about the question that haunts every story of slavery. How many voices were silenced? How many lives were stolen? How much knowledge and wisdom and human potential was deliberately destroyed because it threatened the economic and social order of a society built on the ownership of human beings? Marcus Freeman lived a good life after slavery ended. He became a physician, helped countless people, raised a family, and died respected and mourned. But he was one of millions who were enslaved, and we will never know how many others carried within them gifts and memories and knowledge that were never allowed to flourish. The Latin-speaking slave child who remembered being a Roman physician is a documented historical fact. What it means, whether it proves reincarnation, demonstrates some unknown capacity of human consciousness, or reveals something about the nature of the soul that science and religion have yet to understand, remains open to interpretation. But what is not open to interpretation is this: Marcus was human, fully, completely, undeniably human, and the system that enslaved him was a crime not just against his body and his freedom, but against everything he was and everything he had been and everything he might become. Remember his name. Remember his mother's name. Remember that they survived. Remember that they were free. Remember that the knowledge and dignity that slavery tried to erase could not be destroyed, because some things are written too deeply in the soul to ever be fully erased. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe in reincarnation, or do you think there's another explanation for what Marcus experienced? Have you ever had memories or knowledge that you couldn't explain? Do you think there are other cases like this that have been buried or forgotten? Comment below with your thoughts and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The past is not dead. It's not even past. It lives in the records we preserve, in the stories we tell, in the questions we refuse to stop asking. Marcus Freeman's story is part of that living past, and it demands to be remembered. Subscribe if you want more stories that challenge what you think you know about history, about humanity, about the boundaries between one life and the next. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that needs to be told. And remember, every person you pass on the street, every face you see, might be carrying within them the memories of 1,000 lifetimes. Treat them accordingly, honor them accordingly, because the soul is vast and mysterious and enduring, and slavery was a crime not just against the present, but against eternity itself.